Welcome back to the 1950 Chevy Coupe project. In this video we're going to be covering putting the C4 Corvette rear suspension into the coupe and fabricating the torque arm. I've already prepped the C4 rear suspension by removing the drive shaft and torque arm. I've also pulled the parking brake cables and the wheel speed sensors just to eliminate a bunch of stuff flopping around everywhere. I also had to pull the rear sway bar because it actually comes back quite a bit, like almost a foot, the way it mounts in the C4, and for sure that's going to be interfering with the sheet metal for the trunk pan in the 50. So we're just gonna have to scrap using that as is. However, it's just a sway bar. I can fabricate pretty much a mount anywhere and be able to relocate the sway bar and make it work. The straight axle and leafs need to come out of the 50 before we can get the C4 suspension underneath and mock it up. We'll jump ahead to when that stuff's out and we can start figuring out what it's going to look like. Rear end's out. Still got shocks hanging in there because they need to be unbolted from inside the trunk. I also dropped the tank out. Rough looking at the measurements there, we could probably try to make the Corvette C4 tank fit. However, it's a lot thicker and would hang down and be visible from the back of the car. It might also have some pretty low ground clearance, so probably don't want to do that. Kind of looking at what's going to end up for mounting the C4 suspension in here, it looks like the wheel well is probably going to be in the way. However, if I reach up inside of the drain holes from the bottom, I don't think it's being used anyway. I need to get the trunk open to confirm that, but somebody decided that shaved keys were a great idea when they built this car, and I'm going to have to figure out which wires to jump to be able to open the trunk. So after making a phone call, it sounds like the rocker switches at the center console were supposed to pop the filler and the trunk, so we'll see if we can manage that. I don't know which... Ooh, there's something. What do we get? Trying to get into the trunk, I even hooked the steering column back up, keyed on, jumping everything I could to battery, still couldn't get anywhere. Ended up pulling the back seat out. And then I had to crawl underneath that panel to get to the back to where I could unscrew the latch. What a pain in the butt just to get into the trunk. Hope I didn't ruin that panel. Now that I got into the trunk, I was able to remove the shocks. And I was right that it's not using the spare tire well at all. Actually, it's just got this neat little cover on it, like a little hidey spot. It's pretty cool, but the good news here is that if I got to cut into the front of this spare tire well, I can, and just be able to seal it back off again. That'll make it nice and easy. We should have plenty of room for the rear suspension in here now. I'm back at the 50 this morning after finally getting into the trunk and being able to get the rest of the stuff out of the way in there. I'm looking at putting the C4 rear suspension in today, and I'm intended to get all of my measurements and have a good solid plan before I get started getting it under the car. So far, I still have the same problem I did with the front. I don't know what ride height's supposed to be here, and the biggest factor for that in the back is how cambered out these rear tires are. So the ride height's a lot more important in the back as far as being able to make sure that it's adjusted correctly and in that window. Then we do have some adjustment with the eccentrics on the lower arm. But I'm also trying to plan out where everything's going to go. I think for this cross brace on the back of the diff, we're not going to have much problem. The little steel pads here for alignment line up very nicely with the frame in the 50. I'll just have to make a bracket that drops down as far as bolting it in. Not a big deal there. Same thing with our torque arm. That's not going to be a big deal. I already have a plan for that. That's why we built the bracket for the transmission side. The control arms, on the other hand, are going to be an issue because where they end up, they're going to be buried into the stock frame, where we probably would have to be 100% cut through the stock frame, and I do not want to do that because we're just going to end up making a huge mess. But I am looking at the fact that there's two arms here and wondering why. And the only thing I can see as far as what I know about suspension design and looking at this thing is that these two arms are just to control the rotation of the hub and handle like braking forces. And really, with that being the case, we don't actually need two arms. So to simplify this and make it a lot easier, my plan is I'm going to remove the arms, and I'll end up building a single arm that's in kind of a Y shape, so it'll grab both bolt holes on the hub to keep it from rotating, and we're just going to use the front leaf spring mount on the frame already. I'll have to make a custom arm for it, but it's going to simplify things and make sure that we're not cutting the 50 frame anywhere critical in the back. Got the rear end mocked up, rough position. Still needs a little accuracy side to side. We're just trying to see where things are going to line up and down. This is with it just sitting tires on the pavement, so no compression for ride height. And I'm just looking at where things line up and comparing to the transmission. Now, like I was saying before, I should be able to make a torque arm ahead of time and then kind of work out where the mounts need to be based on finished ride height. Another option that I don't have right now because I'm kind of lacking materials for bushings and things is to make the trailing arm, because at that point then it would fix where the axle centerline location is going to be, which would be nice because then I'm just worried about up and down ride height kind of a thing. However, I don't have materials for that right now. I'm going to have to order some of that stuff. I had to keep lowering the car height in the back because I was trying to get the frame versus diff, because the diff is mounted to the frame and not floating like it would be on a live axle. And it just, I don't know, it's been at least an hour and a half, 2 hours of just measuring and keep moving the car around to try to get things lined up. Right now, I'm kind of about where I want to start making brackets, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to get that cross beam on the diff mounted with one bracket on each side to the frame to kind of hold that in place before I get to the torque arm. It seems like the easiest thing to do. Right now, I've got the rear wheel sitting pretty much centered in the wheel well, but I think I'm gonna pull it forward just a little bit, like maybe half an inch, to give myself a little bit more clearance to that spare wheel tub sheet metal in the trunk, because with half an inch I shouldn't have to then cut into that metal at all. And once I make my brackets and stuff and then get to the trailing arm length will set that wheel back centered in the wheel well. Here's the tab I'm going to make for the bracket. I'm just going to line it up here. It's a nice thickness piece of material. I'm going to have to weld up this hole to just try to conserve material, but that's alright. I'm just going to scribe 2 of these out, just 2, because the other side of the bracket is going to change a little bit based on the frame position, because it's got a curve in it at the top there. I need to remember to add myself in an 1/8 inch up here. Better measure that out. I'm adding in this 1/8 inch because of the difficulty of measuring what the bolt hole center to center is on that rear end as far as the mount holes go. And after I made my cardboard mock-up bracket here, I could tell that one side lined up really well and the other side was off by about 1/4 inch. So by adding the 1/8 in there, this is catching on the inside of the frame, so I'll be spacing them in. That should get it centered and lined up. So we've got spacers in here, and I trimmed my template just a little bit so that that'll line up, and that's due to the dip in the frame rail here. So I'll make 2 more brackets, and using the spacer I'll bolt it up, weld it in place, and then we'll be ready to hook the cross beam in off the rear end. Got the brackets done on both sides for that cross beam on the rear end. Now I need to get the torque arm figured out, because otherwise it sits here with it being kind of floppy. And if I try to put any kind of weight on it, it starts jacking it around pretty good, and we don't want to do that. So far the tire fit up looks pretty good. It's a little bit forward of center, but that's where the trailing arm will come in for being able to adjust it. I also had to trim the frame rail back all along here to clear the tire because of how tight it is on the inside edge, which there's just a lip coming off of the frame, so it's cut back about halfway. Kind of lines up with the inner fender well up here. It should be really tight on the inside, but we should clear. If anything, I should be able to add a small spacer, but I had a 5/16 one and I couldn't even add that because the studs are too short. The big thing of note right now is that transmission height versus where the rear end is. It's way up. Now a good portion of that height is just the fact that it's jacked up in the air. However, the way things are measuring out, the engine and transmission are on about a downward 2-degree angle. I could try to correct that a little bit, but everything I do to try to level that out is going to then cause that power steering line to be a problem in the front, between the balancer and the rack and pinion. And really it's not that big a deal, because once it gets out of the transmission, all we got to do is line up the rear end, which the rear end in the position I have it set up is matching that 2 degrees so that our U-joints will balance out when it's running. And now we just got to build a torque arm that connects the two, and instead of it being nice and straight and flat and level like it was on the C4, we're going to have quite a bit of kick up in it. We still got tons of room for everything, it's just a matter of getting it built. Now, weirdly enough, you might think that this is kind of silly, the fact that at this point I feel like we're starting to get into the weeds, and a lot of that's revolving around this trailing arm setup right now, because on the stock C4 they were a longer arm and a shorter arm that kind of came together a little bit, but they were at an upward angle quite a bit, at least the way it was sitting on the chassis I had. That also had a ton of weight off of it. They were probably meant to be a little bit more close to level at ride height. However, with the way that works out, you know, right now this upper arm would be here and it clears the frame in the front. However, when we get down to ride height, it's probably going to be here and it's going to be inside of and almost all the way up at the top of the frame, and that's just not going to work. And the only way to make it clear would be to tip it way down. And even if I made different brackets, we're going to end up with them trying to occupy the same space, or we're going to end up with both arms way down, and that just really screws up the suspension geometry altogether. And I don't want to do that. I'd rather go to a ladder bar kind of a thing, where we incorporate these two together and go to a single mount in the front. The forward leaf spring mount is not a bad place where it's at, because that's all the way up here. We actually add quite a bit of arm length, and it will reduce the amount of wheelbase change during suspension travel. However, it's too far off to the side, so if we were looking at it from the top of the car, I'd have to have a big jog in it to be able to clear the wheel and get there. So I might be able to take the brackets off and spin them around and reattach them to the frame, and that'll almost get them nice and in line. But where the in the weeds part that gets annoying for me is, you know, they won't be perfectly straight, and there's going to be some change in angle. Almost everything you can buy aftermarket is either going to be a full Heim joint that's spherical, or a polyurethane. And polyurethane, number one, it has a tiny amount of give, and two, they wear out extremely fast in the suspension component. I mean, the maintenance is a lot higher. I mean, I've run them on the front A-arms on the race car, and they haven't even lasted a season. They just get beat to crap. So I don't want to be putting polyurethane on this car at all. You can get rubber styles, but they're really expensive for what they are, and it's just, I don't know, this is the part where it's annoying, because it's going to turn into $200 to $300 just to build these arms, when I really wish I could just reuse what we have, but based on the location of where we can mount things, it's not plausible. Parts came in for building the trailing arms. So this is what we got for a setup. We got some misalignment spacers just to make sure we're not going to have anything too close to binding. I think it'll not really be needing them. I actually was able to find spacers here that'll be able to run on one end, and they'll actually fit into the front leaf spring mount perfectly. I do have to cut the leaf spring mounts off and flip them around to get a little straighter position lined up, and then we'll be basically cutting this tube wherever we need to so that I can weld it on, and then we'll have our fixed position up here and the lower arm. So this morning I'm modifying the rear suspension bolts because they just don't quite fit in the rod ends. I mean, we're talking 4 or 5 thou between the diameter of the threaded part and the shank. So I gotta just trim a little bit off of the bolts to make sure that it'll slide on there, and then I'm cutting about 1/4 inch off the ends from damage that the bolts sustained when I was hammering them out because they were seized into the aluminum hubs. So I'm leaving full diameter for about 1 inch to make sure they fit tight in the hubs, and then we just got enough so we got a little bit of a slide clearance so I don't have to hammer them on and off, kind of a thing. And then we'll be able to get these installed on the rear suspension today and hopefully set it on the ground. First arm is in there. Let's see, we're using the leaf mount flipped over. I got a spacer I made to make the length of that bolt that I cut down work. And we've got this bolted in, and now we can spin it to adjust it. And I'm kind of looking at what I'm going to do for the rest of this bar. So the plan here is I've got the jack underneath the brake rotor to simulate where it's going to be with weight on it. And this is the other bar I've got marked. I'm going to cut it and weld it to this bar after I get the center set up correctly. I want to make sure that both sides are the same length. It'd be easiest just to twist this bar right now to adjust it front and back. Once I weld this, it's still adjustable. I'm just going to have to do it with the front one only because the back two are kind of going to be locked in place. There might be a little bit of, tweak adjustment there, putting a little tension in the rod, but I want to minimize that as much as possible. The big thing here is setting this angle so that when the suspension compresses, we're not going to have problems with it coming up and hitting the frame. Oh. Was able to fully weld both bars in the chassis. It was a little difficult being upside down and running the TIG welder with the pedal between my legs, but came out alright. You can see where it looks a little crappy on the bottom there just from the paint peeling up, and then I just shot some black spray paint over it while it was still hot to really bake it on there and seal it in. Yeah, I couldn't wait. I just got a jack under the other side to hold it up, but yeah, it's sitting nice. It's got a little bit of rake to it still. We definitely got a higher ride height. I'm definitely going to be looking forward to it coming down a little, especially after we put all the stuff back in the front. The front definitely needs to come down some, and then the back we can adjust with the spring. But this is looking pretty good.